Thank you. I think it's time to go ahead and get started. This is Michelle Savage with XBRL US, and you are here for the webinar, Blockchain, Smart Contracts, and Data Standards. Thanks everybody for joining us today. This is a webinar series on emerging technologies. We have another one coming up in a few weeks on the landscape for blockchain technologies, and we'll tell you about that a little bit later. We also have an event on crowdfunding that's taking place on June 28th, and we hope to see you there. It's going to take place in New York. But first, for our session today, I'd like to introduce our speakers. We're very happy to have with us Jeff Billingham. Jeff is a Vice President in Markets Processing Division. He works closely with Markets New Ventures team, where he follows technology and business trends surrounding digital currencies and blockchain technology in capital markets. Jeff leads Markets blockchain partnerships, product development, and industry initiatives. Seth Phillips is the lead bank chain product manager at ItBit. Seth has spent his career building institutional technology solutions and is the founder of 2 enterprise technology companies. Seth got his MBA with honors from Columbia Business School, where he focused on the application of blockchain technology in capital markets. Seth holds a BS in management from the Marriott School of Management at Brigham Young University. So with that, I want to thank them very much for joining us today, and I'm going to turn our program over to Seth and Jeff.
Wonderful. Thanks, Michelle. And thanks to everyone for joining. We're just pulling up our presentation. Just give us another minute.
All right. Yeah, well, welcome everybody. This is Seth.
This is Jeff.
And appreciate you guys listening in to hear us talk about smart contracts. This is a topic that I think is dear to our hearts.
Certainly.
We both spent a few years focused on the space. The space is pretty new, obviously, and both pretty involved in efforts moving forward. So we'll kind of go through some quick, simple examples to give people fundamentals. We understand people are probably coming in to the call at various different levels of understanding, and then we can get into more detailed things in some of the Q&A if there's more technical or more detailed questions.
Yeah, I think we hope to keep this to about 40 to 45 minutes and then open this for discussion. So please give us all the most difficult questions you have. Please feel free.
And I believe you can type in your questions as we go, and then we'll rally those together and respond to those towards the end. So starting off with the very basic smart contracts, there's not really a universally defined or a definition of what exactly a smart contract is. What we're going to use kind of in this setting is just some programmatically enforceable arrangement. But those vary. I think that's actually one of the important conversations to have around smart contracts is there are people talk a lot about Bitcoin and smart contracts. People talk a lot about Ethereum and smart contracts. Obviously, ItBit, we're involved in kind of the in the private blockchain space in financial services, and talking about our systems and other systems like ours to try to manage smart contracts. But I want to make sure people understand there's kind of a range of how these things work. At one end of the spectrum, you could have a fully self-executing contract where everything that's part of the contract is essentially pre-funded and pre-collateralized into that contract, where that agreement is essentially trustless. On the other end of the spectrum, you could have something as simple as an agreement that I would still call a smart contract, or some people may, an agreement that's cryptographically provable because it's put into a distributed ledger, or it's put on the Ethereum blockchain, or the Bitcoin blockchain, or something like that, where counterparties can prove what they agreed to and maybe even prove who defaulted, but it's not truly trustless in the fact that it's not completely self-executing. It's just an anchor point that we can refer back to say these were the exact terms that we agreed to on such and such a date. So that's kind of like the two ends of that spectrum that people might refer to as smart contracts, and that's kind of an underlying conversation piece to have as we kind of go through.
And I think, I think it's important just to frame this in the blockchain discussion. A lot of people will say or ask me, the concept of smart contract isn't necessarily new, right? I think smart contracts are the idea of having some sort of self-executing elements to an agreement definitely predate the blockchain hype. I think the reason it's come up in the blockchain discussion is because the industry has been presented with an alternative with peer-to-peer networking. You have this ability to run sort of have this processing engine that is industry-wide or global in the case of something like Bitcoin. So I think that's why people look to, the blockchain discussion to facilitate how we might be able to build financial contracts, or build contracts and agreements in the financial industry space.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and add to it even that it's also, I think, another reason that it comes up with kind of hand in hand, because you're right, smart contracts could be totally divorced from the idea of a blockchain. But another reason I think they oftentimes go hand in hand is because in the blockchain, you can actually programmatically control the value itself.
Right.
And so it's a way to be able to say, I'm going to programmatically put away $10,000 and let the program distribute that money as the code allocates. And it's not just like a contract that we sign, because value can be tied up in a blockchain. The actual value can be controlled.
And I think we'll certainly show you some examples as you see on the screen right now. I think a high-level sort of example that I like to give to people, and many of you may have heard already, and if you've listened to sort of blockchain discussions and smart contracts, is a vending machine is a good example of a smart contract that most of us use every day. You put in some sort of registered item of value. In most cases, it's a dollar bill or some sort of currency. That currency is recognized by that machine, and that machine doesn't know anything about me necessarily. It doesn't know where my money came from. All it knows is that my money is valid, and then it allows me to execute anything on my behalf, right? So I'm able to get the water or soda or whatever it is that's in the vending machine. In this case, and this is also why it's part of the blockchain conversation, is because now if you can imagine these contracts existing in a wholly digital space, I think that's what makes it so compelling. So if you can imagine, instead of money talking from my hand to a machine, imagine money talking to programs, right? So instead of some sort of physical object in space-time, I or my firm or my industry can execute some sort of item of value between programs that are able to speak to each other.
Yeah, and putting inside that vending machine all sorts of financial instruments and other types of things. So,
right.
Yeah, that's great. So to kind of kick this off, a really simple example. The first time Jeff and I presented this was during the Final Four weekend, so we had Villanova playing North Carolina here. In a traditional sense, if we're going to place a bet on a game, the two of us could agree bilaterally, just between the two of us. Hey, we're going to do $20 each, and whoever wins gets the $40. And we can either just bear the risk that Jeff might not be good for his $20 if he loses the bet, or I might not be good for my $20 if I lose the bet. We could get some intermediary, which is represented by the judge here. We could sign some legal agreement. We could even put the money away into a vault that this judge controls, and say, "Hey, judge, you can unlock the lock once the game is over, and give me my $40 or give Jeff's $40, depending on how the game goes." And this is kind of the traditional sense. If I don't want to have risk against Jeff, he doesn't want to have risk against me. This is kind of the status quo in terms of what we do. And by the way, we do this all the time. This is what PayPal does. This is what a lot of financial intermediaries do. To some extent, this is kind of what Visa does. There are a lot of times where financial intermediaries are really breaking apart the risk between the buyer and seller, or in this circumstance, two gamblers that are betting against each other. Essentially, what a smart contract is going to do, kind of in the simplest sense, is just say we're going to put this into some kind of programmatic system that we're going to programmatically put my Bitcoin, for example, since that's the little logo we have here. We could do it with money just the same. into this contract, and we're going to have an agreement written down that's programmatic. It's going to say, it's going to check the source of, ESPN and 5 other news sources to find out who wins the game at midnight the day after the game is over. And based on the results that it gets from that software script, it is going to programmatically then release the money to Jeff or to me. We don't need someone sitting in the middle because the contract itself actually controls the dollars. So once my dollars are up into that contract and Jeff's are in that contract, we can't unilaterally take them out. The value is trapped inside there, and we simply have to let the code run to decide who's going to get the money.
So there are two critical, if you were to make a one-to-one comparison on what you saw on the prior slide to this slide, two things are different, right? The judge in this case is not represented, and the safe in this case is not represented. So, I think the one-to-one replacement for those kinds of things is, instead of legal code that's written in some sort of defined language that we speak or write with or read, right? This contract is actually written into code. So there is, some sort of bridge that gets, the legalese as we know it and define it today into an actual program. So that's first and foremost, I think. The second is replacing the safe. Now that safe, instead of having to go to a third party or some sort of entity or some sort of, something physical in space-time to secure something outside of me or my counterparty, I can use this peer-to-peer network, right? So the peer-to-peer network actually behaves in many ways as a repository on its own right? So I don't need to, and Seth does not need to, constantly go back and forth between something that exists outside of us. We can refer back to this peer-to-peer network because this network is incentivized to maintain the contract that we have as we know it and as we agree to it, and it's something that we should not be able to tamper with or change without the other counterparty knowing about it after the point of agreement.
Yeah, I think it's a great point in terms of, like, you think about taking out the judge. It's like removing, there's ambiguity in the language that we speak, right? Just, and then that's why you need to have the judge to be able to interpret, hey, this was the language that was used, and so how is that language going to be interpreted against the law, for example, where there is much less ambiguity. Arguably you wouldn't have any. I don't think that's an ideal that's been reached, but there is significantly less ambiguity in terms of, like, a computer reading software code. And so then the computer's going to run it exactly, the computer's going to control it, and you don't need a judge to interpret it because the computer itself is going to interpret what happens. So that's great. So a couple of the things that we think are meaningful steps forward in terms of why smart contracts are valuable and why we think kind of the industry is really excited, or there's a lot of industries excited about these. Is first of all, on the safety side, it removes or lessens, maybe depending on the stringency of your contract, the trust that you need to have in your counterparty. And like I said, since the code has less ambiguity, it's easier to verify and to not necessarily easier to understand, but it's because legalese is hard to read, but so is software code. I mean, it depends on your background. But it is definitely verifiable in terms of if you go in through it or have someone review it, you can decrease the ambiguity there.
And legalese is something that is manual to implement, right? It takes human beings, it takes sort of the systems that we have that are electronic right now, right? Whereas something that is executed by a machine or some sort of network is a whole lot less legal, you can say.
Yeah. And then replicability, obviously the ability to use these contracts over and over again, to be able to script them, make small adjustments to them, things like that. And then agility. The system itself can execute these agreements, even if I am slow in responding to Jeff's emails or Jeff's requests or the judge's requests or the, whatever that case is. This system can just control and run and be more expeditious. One other point that we like to make as we kind of go through this presentation and we talk to people about smart contracts that I talk about a lot in terms of when we meet with financial institutions, I spend a lot of time explaining kind of the technology and things like that with financial institutions. The difference between smart contracts and automation, there are a lot of benefits that I think new technology can bring to financial services in particular, but probably a lot of industries. But we try to make the distinction a little bit in terms of things that are just speeding up or more straight through processing of systems today that might go hand in hand with newer technology, with the blockchain, or even hand in hand with smart contracts. But we can do more straight through processing, as compared with the true, maybe the essence of the smart contract, which is really pure programmatic control or cryptographic verification.
And I think, this also is very closely related to, actually digitizing contracts or digitizing assets versus an electronic version of those things. I think, the world we exist in now is electronified contracts. You have electronified contracts, you have electronified money, you have electronified assets. And to that end, automation helps considerably. Smart contracts managed in a peer-to-peer network is really, it's almost a bit of a paradigm shift if you can appreciate the nuance between something electronic, which is, very simply, if Seth and I have a contract with each other, he is going to maintain a copy of that contract on his books and records. I am going to maintain a copy of that contract on my books and records. Maybe we have a third party ensuring the obligations are, run out as they should be. That person is going, or that institution, that entity is going to have a copy, right? So the automation helps to reconcile all three parties and all of their known copies of one single truth. What smart contracts tries to do is it effectively allows both Seth and I to own the contract in a fully digitized form, right? So my data object is Seth's data object, right? That is something that can be shared and maintained within a network that we both have access to. That's why, automation is not necessarily the name of the game when we talk about smart contracts. It's much more about almost in some respects rematerializing things in a fully natively digital format.
Another quick example that we can go through here is a simple options contract for a barrel of oil, for example. So you could imagine something where we agree to an option at a certain price, and we tie up the barrel of oil is somehow digitally represented. And the oracles are selected in terms of, it's whether or not I execute my option is going to be based on what happens with the fluctuating price of the barrel of oil. So Jeff and I are going to agree on the oracles that we'll use to price the barrel of oil. Maybe it's a couple indexes that are published. Maybe it's closing price from a certain entity or something like that.
And just for sake of anybody on the call who does not know what an oracle is, by oracle we mean some sort of entity that exists outside of this network that is sending or injecting information, be it market data or reference data, or all of the things that we need to know in real time that make our contract run. I think that's probably a fair definition of what we call an oracle. In this.
Yeah, and it's essentially because I don't trust Jeff, since Jeff's my counterparty. I don't trust him to input the price of barrel of oil because he's a trustworthy guy, but he also has an economic incentive to maybe round down or round up, depending on what side of the agreement he's on. And I am the same. He doesn't trust me because I may have an economic incentive to input a different price that makes me the difference between me being in the money on this option or not. So who do we trust? And to provide that. So the oracle is someone or some group that we trust to provide some of that exterior data. And so, very likely we don't even want to trust one source. We want to agree, again, but this can be scripted, this can be written in the software. The these are the 10 sources we're going to check, and we're going to average those 10 sources and come up with the final price. Or 6 of them have to be in consensus. 6 of them have to post the same price. And when we get 6 of 10 that post the same price, we pull the trigger on that and say that's the official price that we agree on. But whatever the case, we can agree beforehand what is the process going to be for determining the price at the end. And we can wrap that into our agreement. We can also wrap the barrel of oil in the agreement. Margining is an interesting one because if we have like daily mark-to-markets or something like that, where the price of oil is moving and increased collateral has to be posted up against this or something like that. This is a perfect example of where you have the pure theoretical ideal of a smart contract kind of face to face with the reality of some of the hard things about how the market operates today versus that kind of ideal. So on the one side, I could, if Jeff is going to have to post some collateral, I could require that Jeff has to put up a bunch of collateral into our contract, and then anytime that he has to post some collateral, so the price of oil moves, Jeff needs to post more collateral to me. The contract can actually grab that collateral and give it to me, for example, or it could earmark part of that for me. Likewise, the price goes down. Maybe I'm putting up some collateral as well, and then it can manage both sides. But you can never, and that's all fine. And that's kind of the theoretical idea, is that the theoretical ideal of smart contracts, kind of on the extreme case, is that all of the value that could ever be part of our agreement, we want to tie up into this contract to make sure no matter what happens, if this is but if this is a $1,000 barrel of oil and the price goes all the way to zero, how much collateral would Jeff have to post? And we could put that much collateral in it to make sure that regardless of what happens, Jeff will have the collateral to put in there. And that's fine. And for an option that may even be sufficient, you could get into more sophisticated situations, though, where if the price is going up, it's a put option or something like that. How high could the price go? Could it go to 2,000? Could it go to 5,000? Could it go to 100,000? And then how much collateral am I going to require Jeff to put up in that circumstance? To cover all scenarios, it have to be infinite. And even to cover realistic scenarios, it might be a significant amount of money. So this is kind of one of the struggles where real financial services bumps up against kind of these theoretical ideals, is that in these circumstances, no one's going to want to pre-fund and tie up all that liquidity, tie up all that money that they might have to put for collateral up against this contract. So that becomes for me and Jeff betting on a basketball game, $20 is probably fine. For a large financial institution that needs to put up $10 million in potential collateral, that becomes a real significant cost in putting that money up.
And I think later on towards the end of this presentation, we can certainly address some of the, I guess, sort of the real world implications as to why smart contracts might not be sort of a theoretical solution as we presented right here, primarily because of the notion of credit. Yeah. But I like this. I like to use this example just to also touch point on the idea that you can use smart contracts for physical commodities. I think that's a really important thing to note here. People certainly ask, well, at the end of the day, you still have to, have a custodian or some sort of storage provider in the case of oil. If this contract is in fact for delivery, move that oil from point A to point B. And that's something that I think everyone has to recognize, up front when we start talking about smart contracts. But that does not mean that you can't, improve the processes and the event management and just the obligation, knowing what it is that I am owed or owe in a contract, be it for a physical product or some sort of notional credit amount. It can work both ways. So I think that the option contract here is great because it shows you that smart contracts certainly can be applicable in a real world commodities scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, this is another example. For the sake of time, I think it's similar, but talking about a repo, a repurchase agreement that that you can move against dollars, that the securities themselves, the dollars can move, they can move together, be tied up in the contract. You could have a prearranged collateral like we just talked about. The oracles that you've selected, be it Bloomberg's or markets, pricing feed that you're going to use to price it, everything you have in your collateral schedule, all those things can be predetermined and be instructed to run. So that's great. And again,
that's another example for you of what smart contracts can do in a purely sort of, certainly you have physical stock certificates still that have been dematerialized in the warehouse, and you have physical cash, but it's not as if delivery of those things is as onerous as something like a barrel of oil or a bar of gold. But you could potentially, I think, improve the processes, really from front to back in these sort of financial scenarios when you're dealing with dematerialized securities.
Yeah, everybody and I think that's generally a conversation that people talk about is, imagine, you can imagine pretty easily a time where securities, like a stock certificate, is issued directly into some blockchain. And then you can have full digital control as that moves around the blockchain. That is true ownership moving around, and there is no kind of real world bridge that needs to be made to the technology. The asset lives in the technology. That's how Bitcoin is, by the way. Whereas something we talk about, a stock certificate, or that still has like a real world piece of paper. A barrel of oil is even more of an example of that. But there will always need to be some trust bridge to physical assets. But a lot of the assets that really drive our economy could be fully dematerialized. Currency, stocks, bonds, and other things like commodities obviously will need to be physical forever, and there will always need to be a trust bridge between the physical asset itself and the digital representation of that.
Right.
A barrel of oil is moving around a blockchain. Who verifies that it's really there and that it hasn't spilled or been punctured or been lost or stolen? There's always going to be some kind of trust. There's lots of cool technology projects going on right now to try to work on that and how you can distribute that trust where it's not one entity that's providing the trust, it's a number of entities or something like that. But at the end of the day, there still needs to be some trust bridge, regardless of how you structure it, between a physical asset and its representation in the digital world.
And on that too, I think it's important to know here, before we get into data standards, a lot of people, and I'm sure Seth, you get this too, a lot of people ask me, well, how do these things actually, where's the programming behind this? Where's the engine that runs this kind of thing? I don't want to spend too much time on it. Again, I think Ethereum takes up a lot of sort of imagery in people's heads here, but just so we're all clear, again, for those of you who are maybe not as familiar with this space, some of the smart contract or contracting implementations that we've seen in the blockchain space over the course of, the better part of 2 years, run the gamut from, again, Ethereum, which is sort of a public platform that is meant to facilitate agreements between programs. We've seen things in the Bitcoin space. I don't think they're probably as prevalent as they were, say, June or July of last year, but people were talking about colored coins. So the idea that you could sort of designate some sort of value or some sort of program on top of a token, be it a Bitcoin or anything else, and say this Bitcoin or this piece of a digital currency is representative of, an agreement between me and another counterparty. You had MetaCoin protocols. There were a whole host of things that sort of came off of the Bitcoin standards as we knew them last year. I think the conversation has certainly moved away from that and towards, again, more towards sort of the fundamental concepts that Seth was bringing up. It's how can you, bring a group of people in a community, or in our case, the financial industry, together to achieve consensus on, elements of a trade or elements of obligations and agreements that we can all agree on, and then run what is effectively a protocol on behalf of each other. I think that's probably the best way to look at these things right now, as opposed to saying, is it built on Bitcoin or is it built on Ethereum, or is it some sort of proprietary network? Suffice it to say, at least in the financial services space, it's going to be known entities and known and provision assets and agreements between those that will be managed in some sort of peer-to-peer network. I don't know, Seth, if you have any.
Yeah, no, I think all those things will run in parallel in terms of. We definitely see the financial services industry, at least the imagination caught up in the idea of distributed ledgers they're using amongst themselves, and ItBit, we are very involved in that. That's the problem that we were working on. Although I do believe that platforms like Ethereum will also be simultaneously running a parallel path and creating things like this for different uses, focusing on being more open and more public, and different functionality pieces and all these things. I don't want to say there's a right or wrong answer. I think there are pros and cons to each one of those approaches, and I think some industries and some spaces will choose one over the other because they value those pros and cons differently.
So yeah, I think the third part of this conversation is really around data standards. These things certainly don't exist in a vacuum, and I don't think the world is going to. I think to a certain extent, a lot of people were trying to change the world in a jail cell. Again, maybe this is about a year ago, but I think it's important to talk about data standards by way of really pushing the idea of collaboration in this space, right? I think in order for contracts to be managed in some sort of network that is not necessarily the traditional hub and spoke, we're going to need to collaborate as an industry on things pertaining to or really sort of around standards as to how do we form these contracts and how do we manage them in a way that's, again, not hub and spoke.
So with that, we can kind of go through some of the data standards, and Jeff at Mark has been working on some of these things, put thoughts together around how some of these things may be considered moving forward. Yeah,
so I think this is just meant to give you a nice image of how I know we defined oracles a little earlier on, but this is sort of how you could envision them actually being, sort of apart from the smart contract itself. So on the left, you have, pricing, you have volumes, you have market data, you have reference data, a number of things that sort of happen in this smart contract that are apart from, the things that me and my counterparty effectively do, right? I can certainly knock on the door and say, hey, let's enter into an agreement with each other. And if it's something like if it's something like a credit default swap, for instance, we're going to need some sort of information with respect to pricing. If there's ever a credit event, that's going to need to be sort of known to both parties, right? So these aren't things that I affect or that my counterparty sort of create, but they're things that we need to know. I think for all intents and purposes, you can look to those things certainly being integrated into a peer-to-peer network and managed sort of within that network, but they exist outside of the smart contract. There have to be sort of port of entries for a lot of the information that needs to hit a smart contract outside the network and managed by those trusted third parties that participants in the smart contract agree to. And again, the contract data, we have data standards to allow us to sort of minimize the degree of work that needs to be done, but make sure that our contract is fully validated and legalized and provisioned. Those kinds of standards, those kind of contract data standards, are things that we can absolutely use and in fact will require in the smart contract space. So I know XBRL provides a lot of that. A lot of people ask about, fix protocols in here and how can that be integrated. That's something that I know the industry is looking at. We offer, at Market, offer a lot of reference data and just a lot of smart contract provisioning that allows counterparties to do the minimal amount of manual work required to ensure that the contract is legal and provisioned in the best and most efficient way possible. So Seth, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but we can continue on to the next page. So this gets into some of those contract components that I think are really important, and we spent a lot of time really clarifying this at Market and seek to really have the industry sort of start to understand start to unpack what are the things that actually exist in a contract that are advantageous to implement in some sort of peer-to-peer consensus network. So first and foremost, you have peer transactions, right? Those are the transactions that are initiated by one or more parties in the contract. So I create the contract, my counterparty can step out of the contract, I can novate. There are a number of different things that I initiate as somebody who is part owner to an agreement, right? Those kinds of things will always sort of require participation on behalf of me or my firm or whatever the contract is really about. It's always going to require some sort of interaction with another sentient human being. And those things are certainly going to require sort of front-end development. They're going to require just interfaces that we are all familiar with today. I don't think that's really ever going to go away in the smart contract discussion. But again, moving to the center, you have market transactions. Those are the things that are, unanticipated, and they can change the characteristics of my contract. So here, very simply, if you think of price, and as Seth spoke about, margining can be determined, that can change quite a bit based on market data, right? So there are things that have to happen to our contract that are outside of, they're exogenous to me, they're exogenous to my counterparty, but they're things that we both have to know about in real time and agree upon in real time. Those are the kinds of things that I think smart contracts can certainly help out with, right? Those are the kinds of things, so long as my counterparty and I agree to what data to actually use, that is the idea of using a smart contract or peer-to-peer network to manage those is very advantageous for both parties to a contract. And then you have those asset transactions. So on the right, you have transactions that are future dated. You anticipate them, but they're ultimately discretionary, right? Unless we have agreed in some sort of predetermined arrangement that I will be sending, or you have some sort of access rather to my cash or the things that I am obligating in this contract. I will certainly be in full control or custody of the assets that I owe to you up until the point where I send those for settlement. So again, it still remains to be seen how can we actually maintain or manage asset transactions in a way that allows me to maintain full custody over the things that I own up until the point that I don't.
Yeah, I think all this just, I think that underpins all this. And I think everyone anticipates in the financial services space that as assets become more and more digital and more programmatic, and you can control them more in smart contracts or something like them, that there's the opportunities can really open up in terms of new financial products. Now more than ever, imagine a future state where my oil is digitized, my stocks and currencies and bonds are digitized, and all these things are in blockchains, and I can cross-trade them and transact and do in-kind transactions. I don't need to settle everything for cash anymore. I could settle, since we can use an oracle to determine what the price of my barrels of oil are, I could settle my stock trade for my barrels of oil at the price at a certain moment in time. But then you can get into all sorts of complexities. Once it's all programmatic, you could build derivatives on derivatives. You could build, you can build all sorts of complex systems that the code is written on. The importance is, and the reason why I think it's really interesting is once you're agreeing, Jeff talked about this a little bit earlier before, but if I keep a track of a really complex financial instrument on my end, and Jeff keeps a track of a really complex financial instrument on his end, the more complex it is, the more likely we're going to have misunderstandings about what we supposedly agreed to. But when we share the data object, so when we both look at this chain, the blockchain, and it programmatically is reaching consensus to decide what that object is, and we're both agreeing to be bound by that consensus of that network, of that system, then the two of us are really looking at the same thing. And so really the complexity can be much higher with not as much chance of of the two of us seeing this differently because we're looking at the same thing. And then I allow different types of these transactions to happen more fluidly, more freely.
Certainly.
So, thanks.
Yeah, so that covers the contract side of things, and I think we do want to end on some of the real world things that we've touched on briefly throughout this presentation. So some of the risks and outstanding issues. I think a big determination here is going to be the legal framework, right? Right now, contracts exist, and I don't want to say the fallback, but there is the architecture that maintains and enshrines the contracts that I have is built upon legal framework. So those are, the route human to human, sort of elements that we have built up over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So there has to be some sort of legal framework here, because that legal framework is the base level for things like code standards, right? Only with legal understanding can we actually start to build up how those architectural elements, if you will, can be encoded into something like a program, right?
Yeah, I think a perfect example of that is if Jeff and I agree that this is how our simple bet on North Carolina and Villanova basketball game is going to happen, and we agree to that and sign off on that, and then I get the $40 because I happen to win the bet, but the legal framework isn't there, and a judge would disagree and say Jeff should have gotten $40, or that's not a legal bet, and you both need to take your $20 back because it's not legal for Seth to take that. Then regardless of what we're doing programmatically in the digital space, if it's not underpinned by true legal framework, then who wins? It brings up a question about something could happen digitally, but then a court, what do you do when the judge comes back and says, hey, I demand you to return that money?
Right.
And then you didn't accomplish what you wanted to accomplish because the legal framework wasn't there.
Right. So I think that just goes back to reiterate that there are we do require the sort of the institutions that have maintained contracts in physical space, time, and paper just as much in the digital world. And again, once you sort of achieve those contract or code standards, can you achieve the replicability that you would require or you would hope to have in a fully digital space, right? If I can sort of replicate, just think of how quick it is to replicate any item of that you need, some sort of resource online as opposed to in the real world, right? I don't have to copy something or paste it or scan it or whatever, right? You should be able to replicate these things really on demand, and that will come, and we'll achieve that, but only if we sort of, address the first two sort of bottom parts of this triangle. And last, but certainly not least, and I think this brings it back to the real world, these are some of the outstanding issues that I think we certainly need to address. So first and foremost, a lot of people listen to the term smart contract and they think a runaway train, right? They think here's something that's going to exist outside of me, outside of my firm or what have you, and it's going to be in full control of and custody of my assets. It's going to be able to sort of just take things at will. That, suffice it to say, is not going to be what a smart contract is. It's not going to be how a smart contract behaves, right? That's not something that I think really anybody would want. So things like gate checks, right? Some points of human interaction are always going to be sort of desired. At very least, when people start to dip their toes into the sort of smart contract discussion. A lot of contracts today, here and now, we hope that they are as route as possible, but people build optionality into contracts today. People build in reversibility to contracts today. These are things that we have to just take into consideration when we're talking about smart contracts as sort of these bot entities that exist in a peer-to-peer network.
And I would say some of those things like one of different, not and I don't know if I feel necessarily like things should go one direction or the other direction in terms of some of these risks or outstanding issues. This runaway train in particular. I think there's lots of theoretical reasons why you want the smart contract to be like purely autonomous with no gate checks optionality or reversibility, and reasons why you'd want them to be. But this is a clash with the real world, so either the world's going to have to adjust to this this new, because reversibility of transactions, for example, causes all sorts of headache in their financial system today. Checks can bounce, for example. ACH deposits can go bad. I can, you know, there are lots of other examples in the corporate world through defaults and a transaction that I made. I think that it happened. I received my cash, so I deliver my good, and then the cash goes bad. I found out after the fact, or a trade gets reversed. So that causes all sorts of headaches. But on the other side, it's pretty scary to have no reversibility, because if I accidentally fat finger a trade and type in the wrong thing, or my system gets it wrong, or I send the same trade twice on accident, and my counterparty says with a big smile, like, "Hey, great, I'll take both of these on because they were a great trade for him," then perhaps I'm in trouble. And the systems today allow for some level of reversibility. And so this is just a big question mark in terms of, should the world move more to these like absolutes, or do the technology systems that are being built going to move more towards the real world to accomplish what's being done today, or are we going to end up in some new place that's something that's yet to be figured out?
Yeah, that's great, and I think that leads in very well to the second portion of, you know, who sees what, and this is part of the blockchain discussion in general, right? I think there's a lot of apprehension around just information secrecy, data privacy, counterparty validation. Really, how do I know who I'm dealing with? How do I know that they only see what it is that I want them to see? How can I ensure that the information that is bestowed into me that is private to me or my firm stays that way? You know, I am certainly a big proponent of smart contracts being able to really enforce these kinds of things. I think there's sort of this, on a high level, people think that, you know, everything is going to be known to everyone everywhere when we talk about blockchains. But you know, certainly in financial services, you know, your data is going to be managed really unto you, and I think really it's going to be managed a whole lot better in a system that is as robust as, you know, a network, as opposed to going to one single person to manage all the characteristics that I know about me. You know, that is frankly, it's a security point of concern. And managing these things in a smart contract or again, in some sort of network, I think will actually go to improve a lot of the privacy that people seek to have with contract management. Yeah,
and again, I think it brings up the question about not only who sees what in today's world. It's another clash. You know, who sees what in today's world? Some things are very public, some things are very private. Do we want those things to stay the same, or should they stay the same? Certain parties want them to stay the same. Certain parties want them to change. And so, kind of, what is that? There are certain data elements on a blockchain, on a pure blockchain, thinking of like a Bitcoin or Ethereum style chain, although private chains can have a lot more different approaches. But in terms of the big public chains that are out there, there is certain data that is exposed to the chain when we transact. And I can do some things to obfuscate or hide that or whatever, but some data is being exposed. And the question is, like, is that the appropriate amount? Should it be more? Should it be less? Again, it's a clash with the real world. It's going to require the technology to change to what's being done, or change, you know, the real world to embrace kind of a new reality of you know, what data is shared.
And if I could parse that a little bit more, I would say that there are two different sort of, you know, we're talking about two different things, really, when we talk about information here, right? There are those things that you know, data, some big players in the financial space manage data, and they have a handle on data really, really well. Those kinds of things, if implemented in a blockchain, could be commoditized very quickly, right? So those things that I think a lot of people sort of make money on by managing will be sort of known unto the network. I point to Bitcoin a lot. You know, I say Bitcoin is. I know. You know, I don't necessarily know who has Bitcoin or why, but all of the Bitcoin that exists, we see where it moves and how it moves and how quickly it moves, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Those are sort of elements of trading that are typically owned by, you know, a whole variety of exchanges, clearinghouses, infrastructure providers, et cetera. But I think on the other hand, you do have that data that is closely held, that is associated with me, right? There are data characteristics about certain parties that will and should always remain private. And in fact, I think something like a peer-to-peer network can go very far to actually ensure that better than third parties. And then last but not least, I know I'd love to leave just a few minutes. I know we have a bunch of questions, but who controls the assets? And I think we discussed this earlier, right? We have to have some concept of credit or some sort of explicit representation of credit, because we're certainly not going to be pre-funding all of these large, bespoke, exotic contracts in the financial services space. So, as Seth said, a bet between him and I on a sports game is very, very different from some of the more bespoke products that we see in financial services.
Yeah, so with that, I mean, we'll just be quick. I think we should turn it over to questions now. I think Jeff and I are both big believers that there's a lot of opportunity for the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll just say that.
Yeah.
And so we can turn it over to questions now. Michelle, do you want to take back over control during the question period, or do you want us to keep our screen up?
Sure. You can go ahead and keep your screen up while we go through some of the questions that have been submitted. And just for everybody on the line, I think many of you have figured out how to send in questions, but just click on the Q&A link and send us the questions that you have. We'll get to as many as we can. Any that we can't cover, we'll try to respond to later on. And I may ask Jeff and Seth if they can look at some of the questions that are coming that we didn't have a chance to go through. So do you want to just kind of start from the top on the questions here? And I think the first question relates to does the country's legal system accept legal contracts written in code or programs?
Yeah.
I don't know if you can answer that one.
I'm not an attorney.
Yes, yeah, neither of us are, but it certainly, I mean, that goes to speak to that. I would just point you to that hierarchy, right, that we discussed. You have to consider the fact that there are different countries, there are different jurisdictions that have different legal requirements for their citizens, for the firms that operate within those borders. All of those things need to be considered before we can actually build something like a smart contract. So yeah. There's going to be, I think interoperability is a big theme here. Certainly required to build something that is scalable for people across borders.
Yeah, and I would probably even go out on a limb a little bit and say I would guess that most legal systems aren't fully prepared to have like a fully smart contract underpinned by legal frameworks yet. I think we've seen that happen with Bitcoin in terms of a lot of countries are kind of struggling to what to do with this and how to manage it. I think it's the same type of thing. It's at least new at a very minimum.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. The next question is, how robust is the technology in terms of resisting cyber attacks?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really depends on the technology itself. There's lots of these private systems like that IPIT is building that are different. I think the most common ones to speak to are Bitcoin and Ethereum, and I would say they have proven to be very robust. Not without their struggles, but proven to be very strong against their open systems where anyone could act and try to be a bad actor and try to bring the systems down, break them, challenge them. There's no disincentive to attacking the Bitcoin network right now. I could spin up my computer and try to go after it, but it's proven to be very strong.
Yeah, I think that really speaks to it's really a networking question, right? I think that's how peer-to-peer networks have changed the conversation in terms of in terms of security, because if you increase redundancy amongst a bunch of participants in a network, you again in theory are able to ensure that one person cannot wrest control over every single copy of what we've agreed to. So it goes back to consensus modeling. And in Bitcoin or even public networks, you can even start to talk about game theory. Why do people come to an agreement as quickly or slowly as they do? And I think in the financial services space, you'll certainly see, as it's building, a private network, you'll have some degree of permissioning and understanding that the security or robustness of a network can grow to a certain extent in proportion with the number of people you have actually participating in that network.
Okay, great. And okay, the next question, how do you propose auditing these transactions? Or has that even been considered? So, and a lot of the questions are asking things that I don't think have been decided yet, but
yeah,
take a step on that one.
Yeah, I can jump on that one. I think that's one of the I think strengths of systems like this is like for Bitcoin, for example, and Ethereum for that matter, they're open systems. Everybody can see every single transaction. I can print out someone's history. I could provide them a history of every single Bitcoin transaction that's ever happened. Now I might not know who is who, but I know all of the transactions, all of the addresses, all of the amounts, things like that. So different systems are built for different things, but like IPIT, for example, for our bank chain, our private distributed ledger that we're building, individual participants will be able to control their own data. However, they could share a piece of that data with an auditor, a regulator, who then would have full access to whatever the information they're permission to see. So without having to request from the company that data, they could just go straight to the chain and get the data for themselves because they're permission to see some of it. So I think they're quite strong in terms of the auditing of those things.
Yeah, in fact, I think if you talk to people who are really, really excited about this, you could even get to the point where in the future you can really commoditize a lot of auditing, and by association, the actual route reporting that you do. If a regulator or any third party who needs to see data pertaining to my book or books and records or what have you, it's just a matter of them actually being permission to access that. It's not like I have to run a report, download it, send it off via an email or something like that, right? The idea that my reporting, what is known unto me in this network can be shared very quickly and securely with somebody like a regulator makes that sort of route process of audit and transaction reporting almost a moot point.
Great, thank you. Okay, we can take I think a couple more questions. Do you think the legality of smart contracts will be tested in the courts before legislation, or is legislative activity already starting? It seems we have an analog to the digital signatures legalization process from a decade or more ago.
I think it's a very apt analogy. I think that the smart contract, basically encoding legalese is certainly going to be something that has to work through, at least sort of in the U.S. and the Western world. It's going to have to work through. It will grow up legislatively, definitely. This is not something that. Again, I tie this back to financial services quite a bit because that's market's bread and butter, and that's probably why a lot of you are on this call. So we're going to have to see some semblance of an understanding of how can we start to build programs out of what we know today as the English language.
Yeah, I would say, and I think those are probably parallel paths. I don't think you have to, it's a binary thing. I think it'll probably be a combination of both. I think regulators are already starting to deal with digital currencies and how do we deal with fully digitized value and its movement. And then you're going to have, but they're never going to think of everything, obviously. And a lot of other things will come up organically in terms of like a situation will come up regarding a certain type of agreement that was struck. And now how are we going to treat this legally? And then, so I think you probably have both of those things happening.
Great. The next question is, how often can these programs go awry, assuming that there are no cyber attacks and not perform as expected? Do you think that's possible?
Yes, I think that's possible. I mean, the agreements we're talking about, the agreements themselves being software encoded, they will only be as good as the code they are written in. And so if the code has errors or bugs, those will be embedded straight into the system. And could you have a circumstance where, Jeff and I were trying to bet on the game, but because of a software glitch, the wrong person got paid? Yes. If there's a mistake in the code and it went the wrong way, then it went the wrong way. And I think purists would say, technology purists would say, the contract is the golden rule, so the software is the golden rule. So that would be the software with its bug embedded is the golden rule. So however it decided the correct way. Right. Others might say, we need to remove the bug and try again. But absolutely it's possible for these to not perform correctly. Yeah,
and I think just to sort of play devil's advocate in favor of smart contracts, I don't necessarily think that changes the paradigm of how we operate today either, right? I think that contracts can go awry probably just as frequently in the real world as they do, or as they will and they could in the smart contract world.
Thank you. I think that's all the time that we have today for questions. Seth and Jeff, this has been great. It's been really helpful, really interesting. We do have a lot of questions. Would it be okay if I try to forward some questions on to you to get them answered for those individuals who did ask questions that we didn't get to?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Really appreciate the time today for everyone who joined, and we'll certainly look back to try and answer as many questions as we can. Yeah, thanks for listening, everyone.
That's great. Thank you. And also for those of you still on the line, thanks for attending, and please join us on June 8th, where we're going to have another webinar on the landscape for blockchain technologies. And we also have an event on June 28th, which is an in-person event in New York on crowdfunding. So it's a half-day forum. Both these events are free. We're just looking to educate and inform and raise the idea of how data standards can be used in some of these new emerging technologies. So expect to get an email from us tomorrow with information about these events coming up, and we'll try to get back to you with Q&A. And I just also had a question. Can you please share with me the Q&A? And I think we're going to try to do that as well. Try to post some of the questions that we've been getting along with the answers. So thanks again, and we'll see you on our next webcast in a couple of weeks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.